Hello again, bl.a here. I am joined by J.J. Abrams, director of many, many things, but most recently the new Star Trek movie. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks for talking to me.
Now, world premiere last night. We had how many people? Thousands of people in the Sydney Opera House.
It's unbelievable.
And the reaction when the credits rolled, stood up, everybody clapped. How do you feel?
I'm getting chills as you say that now. It was the most unbelievable, touching, surreal thing ever. It was amazing.
It was a massive, massive moment.
That was very, very cool.
Now, we talked briefly on the red carpet about how intimidating it must be to try and reboot Star Trek, and the way in which you chose to reboot it was a very pleasant surprise to me, and it is in keeping with established ideas in Star Trek.
Right.
How many different sort of permutations did you go through trying to find the right way to restart this series?
Well, the writers and the producers and I, the five of us, got together and just started trying to talk about what version of this movie would work for all of us. And when I say all of us, we had one of the writers who's an avowed Trekkie, just knows every detail about the whole Trek canon. And then we have one of the producers, Brian Burke, who'd never seen an episode or a movie. So we had this range that really allowed us to sort of talk through stories that make sure that it worked for all of us. And once we knew there was a story that we all could get behind and get excited about, that was the place to start.
What's your favorite thing about Star Trek in general?
I think the thing that struck me, and as someone who was not a fan going into it, the thing that struck me looking at it as a film was its inherent sense of optimism. That idea that, yes, it's a fantasy, but that hundreds of years from now we would all survive, we would work together, we would have to, and we would, that idea of, going where no one's gone before, going boldly where no one's gone before, it's a cliche, it's been around for so many years, but when you actually think about it, that idea of traveling beyond what we know, not to conquer, not to, destroy, but to explore and discover. And there's just something kind of wondrous about that I think has, in many ways, has sort of been either relegated to cliche. There's that sense of we're all knowing and it's all sort of done. But when you actually think about it, there's sort of a beautiful idea there. And I think that the characters are terrific. So
it's definitely a character-based series. How hard was it to cast?
It was. Everything seems to be hard to cast always, but this was particularly difficult because you have these iconic characters. You have these amazing actors who brought them to life originally. We just had to find people who, to do the best we could, to find people who could do that again, and not to try and replicate what was done, but to take the spirit of what was done, 40-some years ago and make it relevant for today.
It's a very, very high energy film, much more so than any other version of Star Trek we've seen either on TV or film, regardless of which generation it's set in. Was that something you desperately wanted to put in there to give that a whole new sort of punch?
Yeah, I always felt that the Star Trek that I knew and saw, in some cases because of the era in which it was created, it's a very different, vernacular of storytelling on film, so the pace would be much slower, and obviously the resources they had were very limited. So there's a lot of talk about action and adventure, but not as much evidence of it. The movies that they made, though there were some spectacular visual effects and stuff, the pace of those films, especially the first one, was much slower, and which some people love. It's just not my speed. I mean, I wanted to do something that was fast-paced, that had great energy, that also took moments and slowed down and was about the people. But it was important to me that this movie have an incredible urgency to it. And, that pace is sometimes frenetic, but to me, it was appropriate for the story.
Now, with a property that is as old as Star Trek, and with characters we've known so well for so many years, how tough is it to keep us emotionally engaged and worried about the characters when you put like Spock in danger? We are pretty sure that you're not going to kill off Spock. What sort of directorial challenge does that represent?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is Star Trek, this film, is not a true prequel, meaning there's an altered timeline. So where these characters live, it's not the problem that you see in a lot of prequels where you're like, I don't care how exciting you make this sequence. I know, I've seen Alec Guinness as an old man. I know he lives. You know what I mean? You can tell me I know he doesn't die. For a fact. You know, this movie doesn't have that problem because it literally doesn't have the continuum isn't literally the TV series. So you don't know where they go, anything could happen. Having said that, the problem you're describing is true in any narrative. You know, if you're going to have a major character, especially, you know, you have James Bond, the odds that James Bond dies, slim, you know, but you want to see the struggles he goes through. So for me, the characters, you know, their struggle and what they experience in the movie, it's more about what would I do in that situation? How would I handle that? The added benefit of this movie is, you know, the advantage we had, I should say, is that you know Kirk is Captain Kirk. You just know Captain Kirk. So when you meet Kirk, he's hardly Captain. So part of the fun of the story, I think Alex and Bob did an amazing job, you know, in telling that story and that journey, is that you get to see how he goes from literally this infant, this newborn, to a young man who's aimless, who's a punk, you know, to a guy who starts to sort of find his way despite his winning at all costs attitude, you know, to earning that captain's chair. And that to me is a great story regardless of where it takes place.
Now, a lot of the effects in the film are spectacularly well done.
Oh, cool.
What sort of balance between practical and CG are we looking at in the film?
Well, you know, obviously, I knew going in it was going to be an enormous amount of visual effects, and all the, you know, space scenes would be very difficult to do practically. So we knew that, but I also wanted to make sure the movie didn't feel like this kind of artificial CG thing like we've all seen. So we worked very closely with Industrial Light and Magic, who are the best in the business at visual effects, and Roger Guyette, who's our visual effects supervisor, who's a genius. And we wanted to make sure that the visual effects were following the look of what we were doing practically. And we shot the movie on film. We shot using, you know, anamorphic lenses, and the DP, Dan Mindel, who's fantastic. And I had a lot of discussions about, obviously, what the style of the movie would be, what it would look like, and I really wanted this thing not to feel like a green screen movie, like there were actors just acting in front of nothing, right, and then we'd fix it later. I wanted to, as much as possible, find locations, find sets, shoot practically. So we built the sets we could build. We found locations where we could find locations, and it helped enormously because we could react to the light. We could actually have actors and characters, you know, inside the space. The camera could move with a certain freedom because we were really there. It didn't have that weird kind of proscenium, static feeling that a lot of sterile looking, you know, green screen work has. And there was a lot of green screen used to sort of, you know, extend sets or to put something outside the view screen of the bridge, for example. But we were working really hard to shoot as much as we could. Then ILM would look at what we were doing, very closely follow the dailies, and everything, of course, was storyboarded and pre-visualized. But when they would start to deliver shots, even at early stages, I recognized that they were literally using the lenses we were using. They were using the lens flares that we were doing. They were using the certain kind of the style of the operation. They were literally studying how Colin Anderson, who's our first camera operator, camera operator, how he would do his work. You know, how we would position the cameras and you know, use the practical tools, and they were duplicating that in the CG realm. So it became there's an added element that you might not even notice if it weren't there, but it feels so much better that it is, and it would just integrate what is completely synthetic with what was mostly practical, and it helped blend those two worlds, which are typically speaking very difficult to coexist.
Updating the look of the Enterprise and the bridge and everything, what sort of process did you go through to do that? Because when you look at the old series, it definitely looks dated, but you don't want to take it too big a departure also, so...
Well, you know, if we had taken the original plans in the vault at Paramount and said, let's build this, it obviously would have been ridiculous, especially at the resolution that we're talking about. I mean, that kind of, on an IMAX screen, you know, seeing that original set wouldn't have worked. And yet we didn't want to necessarily reinvent you know, everything from the ground up and have the Enterprise look like it was a different thing altogether. So knowing that the silhouette of the ship was more or less going to remain what it is. And the idea clearly of a bridge having to be a round sort of design, having there be the view screen. We wanted to maintain the kind of the essential sort of the paradigm of the set, but we didn't want to duplicate it literally. And our production designer, Scott Chambliss, not only with the Enterprise but with every aspect of the movie, I think did what the goal was all around, which was take the spirit of what Roddenberry wrote 43 years ago and make it relevant for today. And that just means looking at different designs and figuring out what feels cool, what feels interesting, what feels real.
Right.
And it was that weird thing where on the one hand I wanted it to feel practical, but I didn't want it to feel old. And so, for example, on the first ship you see in the movie, the Kelvin, that bridge has a very different feel. It's almost more of a submarine kind of feel. And we wanted the Enterprise to be their new ship. And so what would that new ship look like? And people have said, oh, it's like the Apple Store. But we wanted it to have that kind of bright, clean, sort of next-gen look. No pun intended.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me. It's been
It's
wonderful.
my
I
pleasure.
thoroughly enjoyed the film.
Oh, right on. Thank you so much.
I really think you've succeeded in giving Trek new life. I'm looking forward to what's coming in the
God
future.
bless you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. Cheers.